Hi, in this video I'm going to be giving some quick thoughts on the first three May 2025 TOK essay titles. I will be making specific videos for each title, so do subscribe if you would like to catch those, and I'll be putting more detailed written guides in the description box as soon as possible. So, the first prompt is: do historians and human scientists have an ethical obligation to follow the directive, do not ignore contradictory evidence? And for this one, of course, you have to talk about history and the human sciences. So let's start with a couple of key terms. The first one being ethical obligation. So things researchers have to do for moral reasons as opposed to just professional or methodological ones. But it is also true that ethical obligations can overlap with other forms, especially when we're talking about basic principles such as making sure that information is presented in an accurate and unbiased manner. A second key term here would be contradictory evidence, so anything that goes against existing narratives, theories, or conclusions. There are various forms of evidence, it's worth bearing in mind. So, on the one hand, you can have more objective or kind of hard data, but you can also have forms of evidence which are based more on subjective individual perspectives, like anecdotal evidence. To answer this question, I would begin by defining what constitutes an ethical obligation within these two AOKs. So, in history, this might be avoid presenting the past in a distorted manner, at least intentionally. And in the human sciences, to respect fundamental human rights, ensure informed consent during research, respecting cultural sensitivities, and so forth. And then you need to consider the role of evidence in these disciplines. So ultimately, historians and human scientists across the various human science disciplines need to gather evidence to support accurate representations of the past and human behaviour, respectively. Now, getting into the crux of the question, we need to examine why ignoring contradictory evidence could potentially be ethically problematic in some way. For instance, it might reinforce existing biases or encourage dogmatism because, if ideas aren't challenged over time, they can become more entrenched. However, you also need to think about whether there are any scenarios in which it might be fine to ignore contradictory evidence, especially when it's blatantly unreliable or comes from some questionable sources. So, do we really need to take anecdotal evidence from a random X user seriously, especially if it's pretty obvious that they're a bot? You might want to approach this question through the lens of a couple of different ethical schools of thought. So we're talking things like normative ethics, utilitarianism, moral relativism, etc. And kind of comparing and contrasting a couple of different ethical frameworks could be a good way to structure your claims and counterclaims. I'd say a key mistake to avoid with this title is concentrating overly on whether contradictory evidence, so kind of anomalies, might or might not be useful. There was actually a title on this very point in November 2024 for that series, but the focus here is on whether there's some kind of ethical obligation to engage with contradictory evidence. So you need to talk more about moral issues rather than just practical or methodological considerations. Right, moving on to the second one. Is our most revered knowledge more fragile than we assume it to be? And for this one, you have to talk about arts and another AOK of your choosing. So let's define two important terms here. The first being revered knowledge, and we can consider this as any knowledge that's highly valuable or respected, maybe foundational to a particular discipline. And fragile, in this case, we're talking about how easily knowledge might be questioned or changed or even completely overturned by new ideas, evidence, or interpretations of existing evidence, even. So, in terms of how to approach this question, I'd start by thinking about what revered knowledge looks like across your two AOKs. So in the arts, for instance, this might be how we interpret famous works, like kind of the accepted understandings of iconic paintings and plays. Whereas in the natural sciences, revered knowledge could be the big theories or laws we rely on, like Newton's law of motion, Darwin's theory of evolution. Okay, so now we need to consider how this knowledge might be fragile. In the arts, for instance, interpretations of works can, of course, shift with time. For example, a painting that's been admired for even centuries can be seen in a new light when interpreted through a more modern lens. In the natural sciences, on the other hand, even the most respected theories could be updated or replaced. So, take Einstein's theory of relativity, which introduced new ways of understanding physics and adjusted how we view Newton's work. And this doesn't necessarily mean that Newton's laws are useless, but it shows how knowledge can evolve as new discoveries are made. And this kind of leads on to the idea that maybe fragility is a natural, inherent part of how knowledge grows and progresses. Um, so, in summary, fragile knowledge doesn't necessarily equal useless knowledge. Right, moving on to the third title. How can we reconcile the relentless drive to pursue knowledge with the finite resources we have available? So again, let's start by breaking down some important terms. The first one, relentless drive. This implies a strong urge to seek knowledge, a constant urge to seek knowledge, and this is usually fueled by curiosity or a desire to solve problems. And finite resources can mean material things like money or equipment, of course, but it could also include less tangible things like time, human effort, and anything else that helps in the search for knowledge. Um, but the key idea here is that we don't have unlimited access to any of these resources. So, in terms of how to approach this question, we can begin by looking at it in the context of the natural sciences. So in this AOK, the push to gain knowledge often comes from curiosity, the desire to make progress, but also to solve very urgent problems. However, scientists do, of course, face limits in terms of funding, time, the type of technology they've got access to. So, in terms of how they could manage these limitations, they might, for instance, prioritize research that tackles the most important issues, so kind of the worst diseases and other threats to human life. And scientists might also find smarter ways to use the resources they already have, like developing more efficient research methods or collaborating with others to share equipment and data. Now, as a second AOK, we can use history. In this case, the drive to pursue knowledge involves uncovering and interpreting the past, of course. But as scientists do, historians also face major resource challenges. So, in the case of historians, they rely on access to archives, documents, and artifacts, but they can be limited due to preservation issues, time, or even in some cases, political restrictions. So, to handle these limitations, historians might focus on areas where new discoveries have the greatest impact on our understanding of the past, and they, like scientists, may also refine their methods and use technology like digital archives and collaboration with other scholars to access and analyze more resources more effectively. Okay, so those were just some initial ideas for these titles. As I mentioned, I'll be making more detailed videos for each one. So please do let me know in the comments if there's one that you would like me to cover first. I will, of course, get around to doing all of them, but I'll prioritize any that are requested. Okay, well, thanks for watching.